We continue with part, I think, 7 in the history of evolution, the doctoral dissertation of Mr. Kent Hovind. The next man with an influential part in this history of evolution was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, born in 1744, died in 1829. Lamarck wrote 2 famous books on zoology, one in 1809 and one in 1815. He was a French atheist. He was appointed by the French revolutionary government. He was very bitterly anti-Bible and anti-Christian. He hated the Bible, especially the creation and the flood story. He was determined to give people an alternative explanation for how the earth got here besides the creation and the flood. He also was an immoral man. He had 6 illegitimate children by 3 different women. He taught a theory that giraffes had longer necks because they would stretch their necks to reach the leaves higher on the trees. Those that were not able to stretch would simply die out in times of drought. Then the long-necked giraffes would pass their trait on to their children. This is known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. There is no biologist today that believes this theory. Acquired traits are not inherited because they have no effect on the genetic matter. Lamarck died in poverty and was unwanted when he died. One of the men greatly influenced by Lamarck was a man named Charles Lyell. Lyell was born in 1797 and died in 1875. He is called the father of modern geology. He was a lawyer, not a scientist. He developed what is called the geologic column. This column today is still taught in every earth science classroom today. The whole idea of the geologic column is based on uniformitarianism, or the present is the key to the past. This method is mentioned in 2 Peter 3, where it says that in the last days scoffers are going to come, and they will say all things continue as they were. It goes on to say in 2 Peter 3 that they are willingly ignorant of the creation and the flood. The flood explains geology. The present processes do not explain geology. The Colorado River did not form the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon was formed when the flood went down. Lyell took the old philosophy of naturalism and applied it to earth history. Sadly, many of the creationists of his day accepted his philosophy. They taught it was time to update the Bible and somehow make the biblical account of creation include eons of time. Lyell cleverly trapped Christians of his day with his erroneous teaching. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology. It was this book that influenced Charles Darwin while he was on his voyage on the HMS Beagle many years later. Lyell was Darwin's friend and urged him to publish his book, Origin of Species. Lyell had a determination to destroy the idea of the biblical flood in the minds of people. He promoted the teachings of Hutton. Each of these men just built on each other's sinking foundation. There was a movement in the early 1800s to disarm the monarch system of government. They saw the Bible taught that you should obey the king, and therefore the Bible stood in the way of democracy. They thought by disapproving the Bible, they would be able to disarm the monarchists. They had political goals, not scientific goals, for teaching uniformitarianism. Lyell often ridiculed what he called mosaic geology. He was very shrewd and therefore never openly attacked the Bible. Henry Morris, in his book Long War Against God, page 65, says, quote, Lyell's dominating motivation was his desire to undermine the authority of the Bible, end quote. The next man we come to in the tracing the history of evolution is a man by the name of Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. He is most famous for 2 books that he authored. The second was The Descent of Man. The first one, and most famous, is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This book also had a subtitle called The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. He took a 5-year voyage in the 1830s on the HMS Beagle. During that voyage, he read extensively Lyell's book. This greatly influenced him to think that the Earth was millions of years old. When he returned from his voyage, he was encouraged by Lyell to publish a book. Darwin wrote for many years but never published the book. Lyell realized that a man named Wallace was going to beat Darwin to the punch in publishing such a book on evolution. Lyell encouraged Darwin to go ahead and publish his book. Darwin published it in 1859. The Industrial Revolution was well underway, and people were looking for some way to justify the cruelty that accompanied this revolution. Child labor, sweat houses, etc. Darwin's book was just what the world needed to justify the cruel, ruthless tactics of the Industrial Revolution. Darwin had a theology degree. He became a deist and later very proudly an atheist. There are many stories of him repenting on his deathbed, but there is still much confusion on the issue. The next key character in the history of evolution is Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in 1818 and died in 1883. He is known as the father of communism. Karl Marx was very much influenced as a youngster by a man named Auguste Comte. Comte, along with Herbert Spencer, James Frazer, Edward Taylor, and some others, were ardent Darwinists. They strongly promoted Darwin's teaching, particularly those on the evolution of religion. They began teaching back then that even monotheism, the belief in one God, was the result of evolution. They said that man used to believe in many gods and gradually declined to just one God. They taught that religion actually evolved. This is a false teaching that is still promoted today in universities. Marx was a very egotistical man. He had a definite hatred for God and the Bible. He was born into a rich family. He was a good friend of Friedrich Engels, a socialist leader in England. They believed that struggle is the means of development. Because of this belief, they thought the class struggle was good. By the time Darwin's book was published, Marx had already written several books and developed his revolutionary ideas. Even though Marx was rich, he claimed to take the cause of the poor class. And by the way, in every communist country today, there are still only two classes, the extremely rich and the extremely poor. Communism does not solve the problem that it claims it's going to solve, it only worsens the problem. Because of the idea of development by class struggle, Marx readily accepted Darwin's book when it was published in 1859. By December of 1859, just 2 months after Darwin's book was published, Marx and Engels were corresponding concerning Darwin's book. They said that it was exactly what they had been waiting for to justify their class struggle. Marx strongly emphasized that environmental influence, like Lamarck had discussed, the belief that certain traits are acquired and can be passed genetically to the next generation, could affect the rate of evolution in humanity. He said that if the environment were changed, people would evolve faster. He thought that evolution could be controlled or accelerated then by handling factors in the environment. Marx wrote 2 very famous books that radically changed the world, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Marx wrote in a poem one time, quote, "I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above," end quote. And he has certainly accomplished that. Because of Marx's doctrine of communism, belief in God was outlawed, Bibles were outlawed, and millions of people have lost their lives in various countries around the world. On Judgment Day, Marx will be responsible for the lives and blood of millions of people. Marx, with his bitter hatred toward God, developed communism. In the next part, which I will call Part 8, we will continue with the Who's Who in the Evolutionary Hall.